For more, we are joined by Gregory Poling. He's a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gregory, thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, could you talk to us about the strategic value of the latest flashpoint, which is Sabina Shoal, and its significance in the broader South China Sea dispute?
The Sabina Shoal doesn't really have any particular importance other than that it's just 50 miles or so off the coast of the Philippines and 650 miles from the coast of China. So much like Second Thomas Shoal, it has a certain symbolic importance. You know, the Chinese claim to it in the eyes of the Philippines and international law is so egregious that the Philippine government, and by extension the U.S. government, feels that it must clearly demonstrate that it won't concede to China's claims.
Now, Greg, one idea that's making the rounds right now is, that Beijing and Manila are both trying to prevent repeats of what happened at Scarborough and Second Thomas Shoals. In other words, stop each other from laying any kind of territorial marker at Sabina. Does that make sense to you?
I think it's much more like Second Thomas in that it's clearly within the Philippine EEZ. I mean, there's really nobody outside of mainland China who would think that China has a real claim here. And that gives it special symbolic importance to both sides. So it gets, much like Second Thomas, blown out of proportion to its economic or strategic value, but it does make it very, very difficult for either side to back down. Because on the one hand, you have the Philippines defending its sovereign rights as protected by international law, and on the other, you have China defending its much vaunted historic rights, which, even if nobody else recognizes it, has become very important to Xi Jinping.
And talk to us about this idea of U.S. Navy ships escorting Philippine resupply vessels. Is this something under real serious consideration?
According to the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, it is. We've heard whispers of this, indications that U.S. officials have been open to it for the last year. I mean, as you've seen, really a monthly cycle of violence directed against Philippine resupply vessels. The Philippines has been the one saying no to this. And the response from the defense secretary in the Philippines, Secretary Teodoro, was pretty lukewarm this time. I think from Manila's perspective, they want the U.S. willing to get involved. They want to know that the U.S. is there. But as long as the Philippines feels it can do this on its own, that's what it's going to do.
The latest skirmishes sparked this debate, Gregory, over whether the Philippines should activate that 7-decade-old mutual defense treaty, the MDT, with the U.S. I mean, should Manila formally invoke or at least review this treaty? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? What are the potential risks and benefits of doing so?
I don't mean to dodge here, but it is up to Manila. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a political decision that would be made by a Philippine leader. If the Philippines decides that some incident rises to the level of an armed attack, which is what is called for under Article 4 of the MDT, then that leader could call for the U.S. to intervene to help meet the common danger. And then you get into a second political discussion, which is Washington and Manila together deciding what the appropriate response is. Even if the Philippines were to trigger mutual defense obligations under Article 4, that doesn't mean that the U.S. and China go to war. That means that the U.S. asks the Philippines what Manila wants us to do.
Gregory, to your point earlier about the nature of China's activities in the region, in that particular maritime zone, if you like, the Philippines right now appears to be the only claimant that's openly challenging China's activity in the South China Sea. If Beijing prevails with its 9-9 claims, what are the broader and longer-term implications on international maritime conventions as defined by UNCLOS?
The Philippines is the one getting the most pushback from China, but it's not the only one advancing its claims. Vietnam has more than quintupled the size of its island bases in the last 2 years and hasn't gotten nearly as much pushback from China. Malaysia continues to develop oil and gas fields despite Chinese objections. So is Indonesia. What's different here is that the Philippines is really the front line. There's so many points of friction between Beijing and Manila, many of them very symbolically important on both sides because of the nature of their disputes since at least 2012. I do think that from the perspective of many of the other claimants and outside parties like the U.S., this is a line that the Philippines must hold because the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award specifically declared these areas to be part of the Philippines. If the Philippines were now to just accede to China's demands, that would undermine the whole regime of international law in the South China Sea. In a sense, if you can't hold China to account even when an international tribunal has ruled that something like Second Thomas is clearly the Philippines, you'll never be able to hold China to account anywhere else in the South China Sea.
So, Greg, some experts are describing China's strategy as cabbage tactics, or militarily overwhelming an adversary to seize control of islands. Do you foresee Beijing intensifying these tactics further? And is a potential escalation over these islands worth it for Beijing?
China's been very careful not to use overt military force, not to purposely kill Filipinos or anybody else. It prefers to use what some experts call gray zone tactic, non-lethal force or threats of violence, the risk of collision, because those things play to Beijing's strengths. It has more boats, bigger boats, and they can be in more places at once. That'll continue to happen. And what we've seen over the last year is China iterating on that playbook. So when water cannons don't work, they'll try acoustic devices. That doesn't work, let's ram a ship. That doesn't work, let's drop flares in front of an airplane. That'll continue. And each of those things is risky. China could accidentally kill somebody or accidentally sink a ship. But Beijing will continue to work quite hard to stay below that threshold. And that's where, for the Philippines now, the value of the U.S. alliance is. It deters China from just going right to military force.
All right, Gregory, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your time this morning. Gregory Poling, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia and Director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.